Hey there, everybody. Good. Hope you're having a good Saturday morning. Getting a little bit of snow here in upstate New York. I understand there's some out on the West Coast as well, which is pretty strange to see. But hope everybody's doing good. Um, so, just wanted to hop on a quick stream here and go through some cool stuff. I kind of try to mix it up and show some artwork that really inspired me to create We Are Scarlet Twilight, or helped me learn some lessons that made it work out pretty well, I think. And also to kind of continue, I've been going through previous issues of Scarlet Twilight as we build up to four being finished and released. That will, kind of give you an idea of, obviously the artwork and the story, but some of the themes and ideas I'm playing with. And hopefully, if you like what you see and you haven't checked it out yet, you will head over to Zoop and back the campaign. We have a hardcover, which is going to be really nice, tons of extras. And issue 4 obviously is coming out and it's just about done. And there's also some ways to catch up on 1, 2, and 3 if you've missed those. So I'm going to jump around a little bit here, but the other day I kind of went through We Are Scarlet Twilight 2, the first half of it, and just kind of went through some artwork, parts of the story, explained what I was going for, how it leads into other things, kind of some of the things that inspired me, or things from old movies, artwork, any of that stuff. Hopefully you liked it. If you checked it out, I always like seeing creators go through that type of thing and share their sort of inspirations, their problem solving, all that stuff. So kind of went through the covers and explained some of these scenes here, where we're catching up on how Captain Lancet ended up in the future with his villains taking over the place, and he's struggling to find a way to there we go, get that nice and big, to put the world back like it ought to be. So his sidekick Maxie takes on a few roles here. He clones himself. He builds secret labs. He keeps Captain Lancet alive until they can come back and figure out what to do about the Scarlet Twilight cult that has taken over the world in the future here, as we see them building up their whole organization. And then we kind of have Captain Lancet wake up. We have a sort of James Bond Q scene here where he goes through his stuff. He finds that his old guns, which in the 30s were just props to kind of conceal his superpowers or explain them, the Maxies have kind of worked up some working versions of that he now has access to in the future. So, and also we kind of ended here halfway through the issue where we reveal Captain Lancet's updated costume. This was a sort of a runner-up option. Actually, it's my favorite in terms of pure visuals as far as my Captain Lancet uniform designs, but it didn't have that sort of 30s throwback feel to it that I wanted to make the gloves a little different, the shorts, all that stuff. So it was a little less, graceful, kind of keeping it with some of those old costumes. So I did have this sitting around, and it kept bugging me because I liked it so much. And I thought, when he wakes up in the future, maybe he could wear that costume for a while before going back to the original. So that's kind of where I left off. We have Maxie kind of running through the plan to attack Scarlet Twilight. They've taken over Manhattan, and they're based in Manhattan, but they've taken over the world. And he kind of reveals their plan here. They want to shut down the train stations. They want to take the radio stations, and then they want to storm the headquarters, figuring they can, kind of cut off the head of the leadership. We see the first version of Satanica's Scarlet Monarchs, the people she kind of appoints to run different parts of the world. Initially, I was going to have these guys be very different, like you see them here, reflect kind of visuals from different parts of the world. But I ended up going with a more uniform design when we see them in the future. And the story idea is just that these were the first ones, and then as the years went by, she replaced them and kind of made them a little more uniform. And they're sort of her main lieutenants, running things all over the world for her because she doesn't really care to take care of all that. And the reason I wanted them to be all different was that if you look at old Flash Gordon comics, there's a ton of really cool, all the different kingdoms that were on Mongo had different looks, and really, expanded the world, made it kind of fun. But when I looked at the role that the Scarlet Kings and Queens had to play in the story, I did need something a little more uniform. I didn't want to. I needed to be clearer, who they were on in a fight in a crowded scene, what their role was, and to kind of treat them as a group rather than a collection of individuals. So that's kind of what happened there. Maxis are explaining, we have these 3 attacks we want to do at the same time. He asks him which one he wants to lead from. He says, "Do you even have to ask?" And I hope it's pretty clear that he's going to go after, the headquarters. So then we cut to this shot here, which is revealing they're sneaking up and they've gotten into Manhattan. They're going to sneak up on this headquarters, which in my mind is somewhere around Rockefeller Center, not too far from there. So they probably weren't too far from the other 2 teams, but so they've built this giant Art Deco, sinister tower. You can probably see a lot of the Fleischer brothers influence there, which of course was a big part of what I wanted to do with the series. And this is also one of my favorite bits here. There's a lot of old movies in the 30s and the 40s that were still kind of in that tradition of big but sort of stagey filmmaking. One of my favorites is The Adventures of Don Juan, which I think is from 47 with Errol Flynn. They have this gigantic sort of palace room, and it's a little sparse. It's kind of weird. They don't have a ton of extras in there. They didn't dress up all the surfaces so they'd look accurate, and it's got a strange look to it. It's got I would say that it's got some degree of artifice going on there, but it made it different. It made it look like kind of an amusement park, but not quite. It was fun. It was cartoony. And I think the sparseness of that is something that is reflected here. I wanted there could have been like street lights and stuff like that, because I kind of like drawing that stuff. But I wanted this to look like a giant set, like a really, really big set. And those sets, while they were sort of fake looking, they were huge. They must have been in airplane hangars. They were gigantic. So that's kind of what I was doing here. And I love, if you look at old Flash Gordon or even Star Wars and things like that now, the sort of group of people sneaking behind the corner to do something is kind of a fun visual. I've kind of thought, I remember watching the Time Machine remake in the late 90s. I think they did that. And I wasn't loving it, but there was a point where they're crawling around caves, sneaking up on bad guys, and they're kind of doing this thing. And I thought, I think almost any movie that has that, I tend to stick with. It's one of those visuals you just see over and over again, and in sort of cool adventure, not necessarily action-y type stuff. Oh, I like that too, of course. So yeah, this is one of my favorite pages. I really think it turned out well. It had all the scope and the sinister, overwhelming feeling you get when you look at this place. And I do set up here our 2 guards. One of the things that I realized as I was getting into the series, and I wanted to keep it to 4 issues, and I think that was the right decision and it's the right pace, was that I found I didn't have quite as much time to establish the villainess, Madame Satanica, as I would have liked, all things being equal. I could have used a few pages here and there just to build her up a little more. When I realized I didn't have that, I kind of shifted gears and tried to find ways, whenever possible, through her associations, through her guards, through her people you see around her, to kind of show what kind of person she was. And that I think was a pretty fun way to do things. I hope it works. And I hope that you kind of see she's very vain. She has an appetite for ceremony and to be told she's great and to be the center of attention, which is why she dresses the way that she does. That she doesn't like people to be too noticeable around her. So you see everybody kind of dresses the same. And that's my rationale for doing those things. She's she's not necessarily an action character. She's not really looking to get in there and trade punches. I don't think she'd enjoy that. Nor would it be a really good role, I think, in the story for her. I don't really want to see Captain Lancet beating her up or something like that. So I think that ended up being a cool thing. It was like a way to really look at anything around her environments. Everything's made out of gold. She likes that. To just show she's a very vain, very shallow person, and maybe build some villainy in that way, rather than, I think I mentioned this in another talk I was doing. I didn't necessarily want to cut away every 10 pages and show her doing something evil, like kicking a dog or something. Just something like, look, she's doing a bad thing, so we don't like her. So that's kind of what was going into that. We have these guards here that look pretty much like the Buckingham Palace guards. I think that was something I think of Madame Satanica looking at, like, oh, I want people to think of me like that, so I'm going to make sure my guys kind of look that way. So I probably talked about this page enough. I hope it's not too annoying, but it is one of my favorites, and I think there's a lot going on there. So we cut to another angle. We got a couple of Maxis up on the building here, waiting to create a diversion and open up the entrance here. We've got a dynamite on the stick arrow, or it's stuck on an arrow. So this is just a pure green arrow gag. Like how he has the boxing glove on there. Just a silly thing. Didn't think that made a ton of sense, but I also didn't want to have a device that was hard to understand. And this is one of the things where the silliness of those old comics is a real asset, I think, because you can do something silly like this. It works. It's like a Warner Brothers gag almost, but it takes place in the language of old Green Arrow comics, of old stuff like that. And I also don't have to show some different shape that we're like, oh, is that like an explosive? Is that C4 or something weird like that? I don't want to get in the nuts and bolts of that type of stuff, really, at any part of the story. They're all comic book weapons. They're not too concrete, too real. Because I always wanted this to be adventure and light, even though it goes to what could be some very dark places. I always try and keep it, at like a PG-13 level where I can. So that's why you get this arrow. This is just a stick of dynamite in an arrow, and it works. It blows up this building behind the guys. Captain Lancet says, "Let's go." And they run up while these guys are distracted. So they give him a chance to leave. Captain Lancet always kind of does that. Look, I'm not looking to cause too much violence. He's going to confront bad guys, but he's not going to necessarily be violent. And that kind of comes out of his origins in the 30s. My rationale there is he was going to be a crime fighter, but he was also a vampire. And he was never I think in his mind, never wanted to exploit that he had these powers unfairly. He would always give people a chance to walk away, even if they were super evil. And that to me would probably be how he squared, it's really not fair. I'm sitting here using these powers to fight people that don't have them. So he always kind of does that. And I think that plays into, a lot of what we'd see from those old heroes in our, I would guess, call it public consciousness, or, if you think of how Batman was in the 60s, that actually became a really big influence to his dialogue. As I didn't plan it that way, but I got into it. That's the voice kind of heard in my head when I was trying to think of how he'd phrase things and what he'd say. And it works. That's very much the tone, I think, that I was going for with his character. Is there's sort of you're outside looking in, and he's a little corny, but also he plays it straight. He believes it. And I like that about that old Batman show, and I hope it kind of came through here. But anyway, he asks these guys if they want to surrender, and they mention that they've heard of him. So we see that there's been some talk of Captain Lancet from probably Madame Satanica or some of the vampires that were initially around back in the 30s. And they remember that his gun was a toy. It wasn't supposed to be functional, or it wasn't actually functional. And they were, we kind of revealed they were probably gangsters or guys that were part of Scarlet Twilight back in the 30s, but hadn't directly confronted him. They just knew, oh yeah, this guy was a sham. He didn't really have working stuff. He was not well thought of. So these guys are saying, what the heck, we're vampires. We can take this guy and then his other human friends. And then we see one of my favorite panels, the gun sort of firing up, and he fires it. Huge bright light. We see some kind of Wile E. Coyote-ish skeletons there, and everybody sees the effect that has. My sort of back of my mind rationale there for that is it's like a sun ray of some kind, so it works on vampires. And one thing with the vampire stuff in this book, I played pretty fast and loose with that. I play with a lot of big iconography, superhero stuff, patriotism stuff that you'd find in old comics. Some of those things I embrace a lot, and some things I put out there, and they're kind of red herrings in a mystery sort of thing. The vampire stuff is one of them. You'd think that would be the dominant part of the story. In most vampire stories, it's about being a vampire. And with this one, I wanted to certainly show plenty of it, refer to it, but make it so that Captain Lancet's vampirism and the rest of the people, it's not like that big a deal. He he kind of explains a little bit later on, and it's not like I have a thirst, an absolute overwhelming thirst for blood. It's just something my body kind of needs, and there's you can really get those proteins other places. The sunlight thing, he said, yeah, I'm sensitive to it, but over the years, and he's if you've read issue 3, you know who he really is. He's been a vampire a very long time, and he's like, yeah, the first century or so it bothered me, and then I kind of got better, and it was fine. Not too bad. I was just very sensitive to it. So that's kind of how I dealt with that stuff. It wanted to make it something that was just part of his character, but not necessarily his defining aspect. Most vampire things, they are just full tilt vampire, and he's not like that, which is ironic given he is the big vampire as far as legends go, which you learn in issue 3. And if you stick around, I'm going to keep doing live streams for this as I try and get the word out about our campaign. And actually, I want to switch over to some other artwork, but also take a quick break and show the campaign just a little bit here. So we're doing really well. I couldn't be happier with how things are going. I really appreciate the support. We have 258 people signing up to read this hardcover in issue 4. We have a lot of different stuff. We have some deluxe issues of the other issue of the deluxe versions. I'm sorry. Of the other issues, regular version, digital, anything, any sort of combination you want, cool variant covers. The hardcover, which is, I think, going to be really fun. It's going to collect all the extra material, and then also some stuff that I'm just going to put in the hardcover, so you can kind of see what's going on there. And there's also some previews for issue 4 I can show. Oh, one thing here, too, we are kind of putting out some prints. I'm a digital artist, but the team at Zoop said, hey, were you interested in putting your original artwork out as high quality prints that you would only print once? I said, yeah, I would. So I did that, and these are going pretty good, I think. I'm always glad to show off my original art when I can. Let me send a quick message here. I'm going to leave you with the trailer for Scarlet Twilight for just a second. Let me do this. So just had to deal with a quick thing there. But like I said, the campaign's here. It's doing really well. I'm really, really excited for issue 4, and I hope you'll check it out. I couldn't be happier with how the last issue's coming together. I think the conclusion, I was lucky. A lot of things fell into place story-wise for me. And I think that it's a good resolution to a lot of the mysteries that we've answered and built up throughout the series. So I hope you'll check it out. I think it's going pretty well. I'm about 2.5 pages from being done. Had kind of a busy week with the campaign, but like I said, hope you'll check it out. One other thing I've been doing is, as I've gone through the campaign for Scarlet Twilight, kind of wanted to go through some old art, not necessarily that old, but artwork that inspired me in different ways to create the series, whether that's how they've dealt with the subject matter, just simple art stuff, or techniques or concepts. So one of the big influences on my whole career, really, as far as being an artist, I've always been a huge fan of Steve Rude. And going back to, I think, the World's Finest series that he did with Dave Gibbons in 91 or so was the biggest thing I liked. That's the thing that got me started and was like, wow, this is a great artist. And really had me wanting to check that out. So I've kind of gotten some scans from Heritage Auctions. I'm sorry. It's a great site if you're into seeing original art and obviously collecting it as well. I'm not necessarily an art collector, Well, I do have a Norm Brayfogle page. That's one of my prized possessions. But it's nice to just see this stuff. If you're an artist, to see something colored or at a smaller size, it's helpful. But if you can really learn a lot by getting in there and seeing the real nuts and bolts, how many lines is in a hand at this size? How does the texture for these rocks go? The shading, all that stuff. Where is the feathering used? What exact shapes are there? So I'm a big fan of getting this original artwork and Heritage. If you sign in, create an account, it doesn't cost anything, but you can get access to these really beautiful high res scans. And so one of the things I have from there is a lot of Steve Root art that I wanted to check out. I love his Superman. It's a huge fan of that. I think he's one of, if not the best, Superman artist ever. But yeah, I think if you look at Scarlet Twilight, you'll see a lot of his influence. Some of his page layouts, I definitely look at when I'm coming up for ideas for things. The feathering on characters, and this is going to be a pretty big part of the sequel to Scarlet Twilight, which is going to be called Scarlet Twilight Cobalt Crisis. I'm going to try and simplify my style just a little bit and make it a little bit more like those old Golden Age comics in terms of I don't want to use color bleeds. I want to really work with fundamentally the same types of tools they have and make it be a little more comic booky and a little less modern in terms of effects and glowing stuff, all that type of thing. And I've been looking at the feathering that they do on Steve Root's stuff, and it's really nice. I like it's simple. It gives you just a little bit of gradation on these edges, and I'm a big fan of it. So there's lots of great. I think his spotting of ink, where you got your dark and light, is one of the best of any artist I think out there. You've got a great balance. It leads your eye through the page in a really cool way. And everything seems balanced. Nothing seems sparse. I think that's one of the things that makes his work. When I think of comic book art, just purely what is that? I think Steve Root is right in the middle of that. Like that is what I think of as pure comic book art. I love Kirby. I love all the old stuff. I love Buscema, the Bronze Age stuff like Neil Adams, where there was more rendering and feathering and cross hatching. But there's something about Steve Root's art that almost seems to work. It could have worked in the 30s. It works now. It could have worked at any era and kind of fit in there. And I think he just leans on his, what's amazing draftsmanship. And his work is completely timeless, more so than any other artist I can think of. So this is from, I think, Legends of the DC. Yeah, Legends of the DC Universe. I have this one somewhere. I've had it for years. I love, the way he draws these things. They're simple, but they don't ever seem to be like sparse or under rendered. Sometimes when I'm drawing something, I get there and I have what probably would work if I looked at it in a week, but I'm like, no, I got to render more. There's not enough going on here. And Steve Root knows how to make those panels just look really great with doing it, I think, in some subtle spots. You obviously have this feathering here. But he's thought to find some really interesting shapes he can make without overwhelming the entire shape. This reflector sort of shadow mirrored version of the letters. It looks awesome. It's a great graphic. He did a little bit of shading you get over here on this edge. It just really shines, pun not intended. So it's really cool stuff. This guy was a sort of point of view character in the story. I think he's kind of a coward at the beginning and he steps up at the end. It's sort of an old-fashioned throwback story, and I like it because obviously I just track down everything Steve Root has done, but I also especially love it when he's drawing Superman, and even more so when he's drawing sort of fourth world characters. And the bad guys in this one were, oh man, I can't remember the names. We'll see them pretty soon. I think they're two of Darkseid's guys, and Darkseid turns up at the end a little bit, but it's mainly his guys causing trouble. I think Guardian turns up in this one as well, and I'm a big fan of his. So we see some cool panels here. I love this. We're seeing how he interacts with Lois and Perry White, and Clark is nice to him, remembers his name, which is obviously a fun bit. He always is kind of reflecting on he doesn't see Clark quite the times he thinks he would, which we know why. But it's a fun bit. This is a page I think from much more recent. It's I want to say it's that Bendis run was going on a few years ago, and he did some artwork for that, which of course is awesome stuff. This is cool to me because he'll do this sometimes where the page, multiple panels on a page, are kind of one image. And I think he's an expert at that. He's one of the best to ever do that thing. And it always works. I have a very clear understanding of, if this were a movie, what the cuts would be, what the logistics are. So I really love to see stuff like that. And you're getting this cool kind of single, but also multiple image. It's very fun, very comic books. It's one of those things you can only do in comics. And I love that. And that's kind of why when I say Steve Root is probably, to me, the quintessential comic book artist, it's because his work is great, but also embraces so many of the things you can only do in comics in a big way. And so you get that here. I don't know who this guy is. I've seen him before, I'm sure of it. But some cool monster. He might just remind me of somebody from Nexus. This bar obviously brings to mind a lot of Nexus type stuff. What a fun panel this is. I'm sure this took forever to do. But you've got a lot of cool stuff going on here. It's very fun. Some more here. Oh, that's cool. I never noticed that. It's kind of a dropped in sort of a Kirby type of a way there. Interesting stuff. I think this is when he was fighting that guy that was the cornerstone of Bendis's run. He had maybe been instrumental in blowing up Krypton. I know that one of the issues I have that Adam Hughes drew starts off here with a fight in the moon, so I bet this was a lead up to that. This is from an issue of The Demon, I think. Again, this is another one of those Steve Root pages. Beautifully drawn, of course, beautifully designed as far as where you've got your darks and your lights. Also amazing in, we have kind of you can tell this is a panel-to-panel thing, but it's also a collection of memories. So there's certainly no confusion as to what comes first, second, third, and fourth, as far as when reading it. But it almost feels like he has a really great dial that shows you, how psychedelic or how dreamlike something is, as opposed to just panel 1, panel 2, panel 3 in a way that's completely clear, which is not to say it isn't clear. Like I said, it is very clear, but it suggests the perfect amount of, I think this is Jason Blood sort of reminiscing or something like that, and giving you obviously some beautiful, cool images here. Again, I love this feathering. And if you get these high-res scans and you can really get in there and look at exactly what artists are doing. And if you're an artist as well, it gives you a lot of cool ways to figure out how to solve problems, to see how the greats do it, and to see where you need to add or push back detail in your own work. I found that's one of the biggest tools. I've gone to art school. I've worked with a lot of great mentors in my regular job who are fantastic illustrators, and I've learned a lot from those people in those situations. But I think I've also learned a ton from looking at things like this and seeing, okay, where are we seeing some dry brush, kind of an Alex Raymond type of a thing? Where do we see these really, really, really small feathers to give you the tiniest bit of graded edge? And how's the thick and thin lines handled here to create our contours? And where do we see like things like this, where you get a longer feathering hatch, not necessarily a cross hatch, which he doesn't tend to do, and I kind of like that. You really get to see what these guys do and what specific thing it gives you in terms of just describing those forms. And even things like, do you see, like, do these lines connect, and what kind of liveliness that gives to shapes as well. So boy, I couldn't recommend enough checking out ha.com and signing up for an account there, because you get to see all this stuff. If you're an artist, boy, it is invaluable to look at stuff like this. I think I'd seen a column with Eric Larson answering questions to aspiring artists, and his advice to somebody was, get some original art, or get a good look at some original art, because you see things on the page, they look polished, and you especially with color in there, you can really miss out. You can be blinded by that other stuff, I think. And that's what's cool about seeing this, is you just see, if you're just penciling and inking, that's your part of the job, and you need to concentrate on that. And this, you can look at color stuff and just sort of be blinded to what parts of the form came from the color, because the colorists get in and out, do an amazing job, and render things out beautifully. So you really need to have a sense of what the specific role of pencil or an inker, where where do they create for him? Where do they leave it open? So I think that's a great tool, and I would encourage anybody to take advantage of that. This is an older Nexus page, I think, for the looks of it. Some cool zipatone. These shapes are really graphic. Obviously, there's a lot of Kirby going on here. But then you get, like, I love where you do this, where he does this, where you get a lot of Kirby-ish stuff, but sometimes he'll just do sort of the Frank Miller shadows where there's no thin lines at all. It's just the shadows. I think that's an awesome mix with your more Kirby-ish stuff. One of these days I'm going to have to find a way to integrate something like that. But again, even his old stuff was amazing. You see the zipatone. The old Nexus stuff was, I think, the first few books that I have, you could tell he wasn't quite 100% of what he would be. But very quickly into that, by the time I was reading Nexus and some of his Magnus Robot Fighter stuff in the 90s, and obviously World's Finest, he was Hall of Fame legend level right then. Oh, this is from Birdman. I know they brought those guys back a little bit. Great. I don't remember this guy's name. I never watched too much of the Adult Swim stuff there, but great stuff here. Again, you're seeing him play with these graphics and these shapes and doing storytelling in ways that you can only do in comics, which is what makes his work so cool. There's some great feathering here. This is I find it really hard to draw hands and angles like this because there's not a lot of stuff to do with them that doesn't make it look like some big lump. But he's done that obviously perfectly. And like I said, having original art lets you really see he doesn't really connect these lines to give that some depth. So this is the light side and the dark side. You're getting like some thick lines here, just a tiny bit of feathering to describe these areas. And this is a really cool hand. And like I said, this is maybe other artists feel differently. But I have a lot of trouble drawing hands like that. So it's cool to see, this is where you learn stuff. Just to get back into this is a great pose. I mean, there's tons of dynamism in that and what's going on down here. But I love, one thing I've gotten into from looking at Adam Hughes' work and Steve Rude's work lately, and certainly when I've been doing Scarlet Twilight, is how well they integrate the sound effects. And again, that's just a comics thing. Although I think some manga does that pretty well also. I'm a big font guy in my regular job. I'm a graphic designer and video person. Really love a good typeface. Really like making that a big part of my work. So I really gravitate to things that shapes of letters are usually really cool on good fonts. And then you can go beyond that and add great effects to give it, this looks like a real guttural panic scream because it's got these semi-jagged lines that still keep the shape of the form. And again, this is just pure comic stuff. You can't do it anywhere else. And that's what's so great about our medium. I love this picture of Birdman. I like the simplicity. It's just such a cool drawing without getting ever, one thing I noticed even when I was a kid, and I love Jim Lee, I still love Jim Lee's work, all the other stuff that was popular then, Larson, Liefeld, and McFarlane and Portasio, just tons of information on the page, tons of rendering, tons of different types of lines, tons of different types of cross-hatching. And when I saw World's Finest, I was blown away by how little he was doing to describe those same forms, but also his work looked as good. I mean, I didn't, even as a kid, didn't look at, McFarlane and Steve Rude and say, oh, there's more there. A lot of my friends did. And, so that's something I've always tried to take away from his work and bring into my work, is how cool doing a little bit less can be. Some great stuff there. What is this? I think this might be some X-Men, I'm going to guess. Some pretty beautiful stuff. Yeah, X-Men. I think it wasn't X-Men First Class, but it was some sort of in-between with the initial 5 X-Men. Cyclops, obviously, is still real skinny. But I have that miniseries around here somewhere. I think I had the trade, but it's fallen apart. The glue was really bad, so I don't know if I held on to that. An awesome Captain America, very Kirby inspired. I love where he does this Kirby thing where you're letting the explosion kind of wash out detail, and that's one thing I'm finding with a lot of the great artists is they don't do a lot of things. and it makes their work look a lot more professional. This is a fantastic MODOK, one of the best. I haven't seen Ant-Man yet, probably won't. But that MODOK looked really bad. I thought that was a joke, meme sort of version of MODOK. And as I've seen reviews, I've realized that's actually what he looks like in the movie, which is a shame. Here's some OMAC stuff. This is, I think, pretty recent. I know about the lettering looks a little older. There's a few pages on heritage of this story. Beautiful stuff. And one thing I want to maybe talk about a little is I love these faces. They're a little more rendered than he usually gets. This one just really makes me think of Wally Wood. Or to go a little further, there was a strip, I think, called Sky Masters that ran for a few years where Jack Kirby drew it and Wally Wood inked it. And this reminds me a lot of that. It was a cool thing, and then it's maybe something worth checking out. Maybe I'll do a video about that one of these days. Some more stuff here. This is The Moth. I think Dark Horse did this in the mid-2000s. This was a great book. I loved it. I think I have all of them. But yeah, this was some great stuff. Kind of an old school hero. I think he lived in a circus. I think there was some trouble because it looked like the Punisher's logo. But this was a fantastic book. I would check it out if you can. This is another, and this is something that's very different for him. All this dry brush. He's still got, the silhouettes and things like that, but this is a cool image. And it kind of is like something that I would look at and say, if I really did want to draw something like that had so much more dry brush, but still had an old school feel. This is something I would probably sit down and look at in my, before I started drawing, and would say, okay, this is a good way to do that. You can go this far, shade in these areas, maybe do the hand like this, where it's a blurry, sort of shape with these feathers, and handle it that way. So it's a really cool piece. More OMAC. And there's something really cool about this page I want to talk about. I love these effects where you're getting the white out kind of there to give you a little bit of smoke. This is a great heroic picture. Tons of Kirby there. Very cool stuff. There's something really cool going on here. There's a rule called the 180 rule, which most of you probably have heard about, where you want to stay on the same side roughly of your character. It applies to film and to comics. You want to stay roughly, on one side of your character. So you could maybe go 180 degrees from where you're at in relation to them. But if you're on the other side, it becomes confusing because the position change is so different. This breaks that rule. You're in front of him here, and then you're way above and behind him. Almost, you couldn't really pick two more different angles. But what makes it really work is that the momentum is kind of going this way. And when you look at when he finally throws this punch, it's going the same way. And I thought, boy, that's the damnedest thing. Like that works so well. You follow that punch, it's a really smooth cut. But it completely breaks that rule, and you barely even notice it. So cool stuff there. This is, again, I think that Bendis run with Superman. A lot more feathering in his face than there usually is there. It's kind of interesting. Perry White's having a bad day. Can understand that. Some cool stuff there. Cool Green Lantern on the news. I forget this character's deal. She was kind of a gossip reporter. I didn't really like her. And this is from that same story that was the Legends of the DC Universe. We have the Guardian in here fighting some animals. I can never draw these types of things right. And somebody like Steve Rude obviously makes it look really easy. One thing that's got a lot of Kirby to it, I noticed and kind of wanted to point out, is you're kind of getting the squiggles that Kirby would do here, but he's really tying them to the forms of the creature, their muscles. And this particular thing where you've got bold shape, slightly less bold, where you've got some things pulled out here and then some feathering going then the perpendicular direction. That's a really cool thing. And I've seen that in Kirby when Royer inks him. And I think it really, serves the story well, looks awesome. And I don't think I've ever seen it done better than in places like that. So this obviously a very Kirby collection of panels, very dynamic, cool stuff. These are those bad guys I was mentioning before. I forget their names. I think somebody's going to mention. Oh, Makari and Simeon. Yeah, cool stuff. Cool Batman pinup. I just have that in there, I guess. Love how he draws Batman's eyes. They get big and sort of like that. Kind of a quick breakdown. And this is another one of those pure Steve Rude it's several images, but it's kind of one image. He's great at that. This kind of has a Norman Rockwell feel to me. I love how he's using this stuff here, the old newspapers. I'm a big fan of using the old newspapers as well, as you've seen in Scarlet Twilight. I sworn that was in it. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, there's nothing that ties it into some of those classic things. Newspapers aren't really a part of our lives anymore, but you love to see it work when it can. Another cool bit from that Legends of the DC Universe comic. Some really cool stuff here. I love that Superman. I love how Kirby it is. You always feel like we got robbed in seeing a real good Jack Kirby Superman when they had those guys redraw his faces. But this was, I think, a good peek at what might have been. So that's one of the reasons it's one of my favorite comics, this issue. Just to see a very good Kirby-ish Superman. He didn't really get Kirby on the face. It's kind of your standard Steve Rude Superman face. But we at least got really good versions of that shading, like kind of what I was talking about, where this shape is a little bit, cut in half, where these are fundamentally dark shapes, but you get a little bit of stuff dropped out of them. I love to see that. And I think that works really well to, give you a dark separation, but just a little bit of reflected light. Cool stuff. Awesome Darkseid here. That's a great picture of Darkseid. Love the mix, the textures, and he's not doing a whole lot here at all, which is cool to see. Just some feathering, but it looks, obviously it's super on model as far as Darkseid's concerned, but it gets so much there, and you get the best subtle expression of villainy there as well. This is from the Nexus Magnus crossover in the 90s. I had this. I don't have it anymore. I'm going to have to find that somewhere online. This was a cool comic. These guys just really belong together. It was very natural to see these two team up. So some cool stuff. A lot more polished, almost like a Dave Stevens look to some of this. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. This is, I think, one of the cleanest runs of Steve Rude artwork that I've seen. Another cool Superman pinup. Lots of weird shading going on there. I think just a sketch, obviously, but cool to see. More from that Demon we looked at earlier. I don't have this one, so I don't really know the story, but some great stuff here. Great feathering, great silhouettes. And he does this thing where he gives you not necessarily just dark silhouettes, but also not necessarily your kind of Frank Miller, consistent lighting silhouettes either. He seems to know just how much to give you there, and it works really well. Cool stuff. I have this comic somewhere. I forget. I think it's called Godstorm. Some pretty cool stuff. I think Mike Royer might have inked this. I think he did a Spider-Man story called Lifeline, I want to say, and also this. So that's some cool stuff to see. More of the Moth. And again, great comic, very underrated. I would check it out if you can. I doubt they'll ever reprint it given the Punisher logo issue, but certainly worth checking out. A great Birdman cover. I love how classic this is. The way the dark shadow up here, it just really makes me think Golden Age comics. This was a big inspiration in looking at trying to put together the Scarlet Twilight 4 cover. This was one I was like, do I want to do something like this? Ended up kind of doing something that was where everyone had gotten to him and had already, there was a fight going on, so there was more violence, but it did have that sort of overwhelmed hero against many villains vibe, which I like a lot. Some more Nexus, I think. Cool stuff here. Very Kirby. Very clean stuff. Or that OMAC. Oh, I have two of those. I think this is from that same OMAC story. Again, a lot of feathering going on there. Really cool stuff. And if you zoom into these panels, this could have been from 1940. It could have been from now, and obviously is now. I don't know how he does that. And it's not, there's a lot of retro elements to his work. He's used a lot of retro stories, but somehow his work does not get overwhelmed by the retroness of it, like some other artists that do this kind of work. This is a tough angle to do a head from. He really nails that. I've noticed that even when I was a kid, I noticed how well he drew angles like this. There's not a lot of clues to give away the form, but he really gets in there and nails it. every now and then I do okay at it when I have an angle like that, but never consistently. One of these days. Some more Nexus here, and just to pull back, I mean, the detail you're getting here in your shadows and your lights is so cool. I mean, perfectly distributed. This is a lot tighter than his later work would be. Kind of mid-early Nexus. So I think I have some of these. Good stuff. Some more Birdman. Awesome stuff there. Oh, it's one of his paintings. This is a really good one. I think that's the Badger. I could be wrong. I don't know if he crossed over with the Badger, but obviously this looks a lot like his other painted work, but there's a little bit of Leyendiker in there, which he does sometimes with the, say these 3 strokes, things like that. He's a great painter. I wish we'd get more painted work from him because there's some pretty awesome stuff. And some more Man of Steel. And I think that's about it. I might pop over and kind of go through the rest of these pretty quickly. Some cool stuff. This is from that World's Finest that I got when I was a kid and still have to this day in several versions. One of the best Batman Superman comics you could ever find. I highly recommend that. I mean, that is one of your, that belongs up on everybody's shelf like Kingdom Come and Dark Knight Returns. It's right up there, in my opinion. So as far as my work, to get back into that, and so after showing you some of the things that inspired it, I kind of wanted to go through and get back to the story. Where I left it is we had just dispatched these guards, and he was going in to storm the headquarters of Scarlet Twilight. So they get in there. The door's been blown off a little bit. And we'll come back to this area in a few issues. He comes back and everything's quiet. But there's still some signs of the damage that their initial attack here did. And he takes a look at this elevator. And there's another. This is kind of like that angle I was describing earlier. That one didn't turn out too bad, but certainly not in the level of the dude. This is a panel I kind of wanted to reintroduce Madame Satanica with. We'd seen her in flashbacks in this issue, but other than that, we haven't seen her since issue 1. So this was something where I needed to explain some things in the story, but I also needed to give you a little bit of the period and the level of technology that exists in this world, and obviously what her role is. So some of the ways I did that, I wanted to have just a silly radio switchboard type situation. This is a big cheat. Obviously, you wouldn't have a radio like this doing a switchboard, but it, I hope, told the story. This is the idea is that they stayed with very much the 1930s level of technology and just made it bigger and bigger and bigger in this world after she took over. So we see some guys complaining his train's not around because we sort of know why. She's hanging back, drinking wine or blood, maybe both. Nobody knows. And we also see this girl who's the, kind of one of the workers around. And you see, like, she's pretty plain. She's not going to dress in any way that you really gets her notice. And I want to suggest that that's probably a good way to get by if you're in the orbit of Madame Satanica. You do not want to upstage her in any way because she's got a pretty big ego. She's very vain. And I hope that's something that came through without hitting you over the head with it. I didn't really have the page count to hit you over the head with it. But even if I had, I think the subtler way is, more often than not, the way to go. So we kind of go through here. We're just doing some plot logistics. She's saying nobody's at Penn Station. The radios aren't working. Something's going on. And Satanica knows. I think she suspects. I think, given these weapons I'm hearing about, I bet you it's that Captain Lancet guy. I think he was due to wake up sometime around now. So she's calmly explaining that to her people and explaining that she pretty much knows what's up. So she's hinting, we're going to have an attack. She's not too worried about it. We get a nice look at her in her, current state. She's on top of the world. She's happy. This is kind of the way I use this frame is right out of Steve Rude. Something I learned from that. Matt Wagner does this a lot too. And it's kind of one of those ways to make it in a comic. I hope it steps out of the panel thing and gives you more of it's almost like a poster to really make this character look triumphant. She's the center of of your attention. She's on top of the world. And that's kind of how we reintroduce her into the story. So they've taken their elevator things. They're still not finding any resistance and thinking that's a little weird. But we know, of course, that she's figured out their game and is waiting for them. So they keep going. They need to go across an outside bridge, which was just an excuse for me to put them in this sort of Fleischer Brothers Sky Captain environment. This is one of my favorite panels too of the series, where you get a lot of big buildings, a lot of scope, a lot of atmosphere. It feels very 30s, feels very Batman the Animated Series, I hope, but gives you, also a very clear place for this battle that's going to last for an issue and a half, really. The rest of this issue and the beginning of issue 3. There's some logistics here. They're on this bridge. There's two sides of it. You could be trapped on it. There's this thing that we'll learn is a Zeppelin docking sort of situation. But hopefully that gives me a very clear kind of a football field view of where this battle is going to be taking place. So that was kind of the rationale here. You'll also notice I was getting a little carried away with my cross-hatching here. I was trying to push Captain Lancet's costume to see how much I could get away with in terms of rendering and giving. The initial idea was to give these black areas just a heavy black ink to them and almost not shade them at all. As the story went on, that wasn't always appropriate for every panel, and I was kind of looking for ways to get a little more form out of that while trying to keep the heavy black shape of it. So I still like these panels, but I think I got a little carried away with that. I don't stick with that for too long. So anyway, they run into a few more guards. Wanted to get one of those big sound effects in there. And he's firing his ray gun, which, again, we see is actually effective. Maxie's got a similar weapon, but it looks different. He's got kind of an old pirate cutlass type thing. Anyway, they start their attack, and then they hear from behind them that there's more guys. So they realize they've walked into a trap here. They're surrounded on both sides and from now above. And it's kind of a nice view here of him looking up at the Zeppelin. I don't think there's any reason to do a 1930s, 40s throwback story without featuring a Zeppelin in some way. So, of course, you have that. And this is also something where I established these new groups of Scarlet Twilight. He says, oh, yeah, I remember these guys. And I slightly updated their costumes a little bit. So they've got shoulder pads and some other elements to them. And my thinking was they were kind of the guys that were around in 1938 when he first fought them, and they're sort of the upper echelon guards. So they get slightly different costumes. And I play around with that throughout the series. Sometimes they're the old costumes from the 30s, which I imagine is if you're not quite as important, you get that. If you're a little more important, you get these cool costumes with the shoulder pads and these things. And if you're one of the big time, people that run each continent for her, you get to be one of the kings, which you see in issue 3, which I'll run through at a video in the future. So this panel, I think, turned out pretty cool. It's one of the times where I think that cross-hatching thing I was trying to do worked out fairly well. So we kind of see a few things happening here. We're reestablishing these guys to the story. And I'm kind of setting up that they, in the interim, have figured out who he is. And we're as the reader, learning that too. So his moniker back in the day for his secret identity was Vlad Kingsley, which is meant to be pretty silly. And this guy says, hey, she knows who you really are, that you're not this hero you pretend to be. And she says she decided to make you an offer, impale her. So I think a lot of us who, I think everybody knows about Dracula. Not that he is Dracula in that sense, the Bram Stoker sense, but the influence of Vlad the Impaler was the sort of inspiration for the character. And so we get a reference here. And we don't go any more into it in this issue, but it's obviously kind of been put on the table. I'm glad to hear in a few reviews, people really picked up on that. They said, wait a second, is he this guy? And I hope it was the right amount of foreshadowing where you are wondering if they're telling the truth. You're wondering if they're right, if they figured out the right thing, or if they made a mistake of some kind. But obviously, I'm putting on the table that he might be Vlad the Impaler, and is not. I'm also putting on the table he might not quite be as heroic as he pretends to be, or he might have been doing it for different reasons. So this was an important panel to the story for that reason, because I wanted to really. Issue 1 has a lot of twists, and it was a fun issue to do, and I think a fun issue to read, I hope. But it set up a lot of mysteries that some needed to be resolved, and some needed to keep going. But I also needed to find ways, especially on the second issue. I didn't want the second issue to just be without a cliffhanger. I wanted it to be to introduce some new things that would make you want to come back for number 3. So that was the idea there. And that takes us up to the end of issue 2, where we're again setting up the logistics of this battle. The good guys are in the middle. They're surrounded from the top, from here, and are in a fair bit of trouble. So I have this kind of very 1930s, 40s blurb at the bottom, advertising that, we're going to find out, is he going to betray his friends? Is he really a hero? What's his real identity? And I'll run through a little bit of that in a future video, which obviously will be pretty spoiler heavy. So those of you who read issue 3 or don't mind spoilers, I'll warn you, but check that out in the next few days. And like I said, the campaign for issue 4 is live now. Also has this great hardcover edition available, which is going to be 1 through 4, plus tons of extras, plus also a little bit of information, some teases of the next Scarlet Twilight story, which is going to be called Scarlet Twilight Cobalt Crisis. And the idea there is after the events of issue 4, which you'll see wrap up, and see who's around, who's not around. That I will not spoil for anybody. But the idea behind the sequel to this is that it's going to be a very throwback to Crisis on Infinite Earths, but in a very 1940s style. So if you almost had DC for some reason reset their universe back in the day, I thought that was a fun way to keep the story going. It's obviously would need to be a very different experience than Scarlet Twilight has been, because the main things I'm setting up here are, who is this guy? Is he what he says he is? Is he going to find a way to beat these guys? And I won't spoil that, but obviously at the end of the story, and it's a very complete story, We Are Scarlet Twilight, those questions are answered, and it wouldn't be, I think, very much fun to revisit them again or do them over in a different way or with a different character in Captain Lancet's orbit. So as I thought about ways to keep the story going, I thought, well, this will have to be a fundamentally different experience. I also had a few regrets on the art style. Well, I'm very happy with the art overall. I don't feel like I quite got as much 1940s into the pages as I had hoped. So I'm looking for, I knew I wanted to be much more faithful to those old comics in terms of, without losing any of the dynamic stuff we've come to expect as far as page layouts and poses and things like that. But I wanted to make sure that I got a little bit closer to that. And I thought, okay, what's a cool way to do some other things that we're used to in more modern comics? And we've had, at this point, obviously endless universe reboots from Marvel and DC and others. But one thing I've never seen is that, even though some of those stories involve, the Justice Society or some of the older characters, and the Invaders would cross over with modern Marvel characters or other people sometimes, I wanted to think of a way to, what if we just did an entire one of those, but like the old comics, with some of the conventions they use, the page layouts, the way the characters behave and speak, and really try and apply that big epic thing to it. So hopefully you'll check that out. But for that to happen, we need to really make this campaign be as strong as it can be, and give me the chance to be able to devote the time that'll take, because I'm thinking that's going to be about 7-8 issues to really make it feel like one of the Crisis books or Secret Wars or something like that. So, which is not to get distracted from issue 4, because I'm wrapping it up now. I couldn't, like I said earlier, I couldn't be happier with how 4 has come together. I think if you really liked the twists in 1, obviously if you like the whole story, but the twists in 4, I think, are as good and great compliments to and resolutions to what we've seen in issue 1. So, like I said, I hope you will check it out. And I'm going to leave you with the trailer for Scarlet Twilight 4. And please, like I said, check out the campaign on Zoop if this looks like a comic you would be interested in reading. Thanks for stopping by, or if you're watching later, thanks for checking out the video.